By the 19th century, Britain possessed the largest and most powerful navy in history. A force that dominated the world's oceans. Over the next 100 years, the Industrial Revolution transformed her battle fleet from timber, canvas and cannon into armour, speed and firepower. The battleship had evolved into the most complex and expensive machine in existence. A weapon that drew a line between nations and empires.
Because the battleship was the ultimate weapon of war, this was the measure of your nationhood, if you like. This was the measure of your ability to stand high among the nations of the world and say, this is what we want, and this is what we'll have, and we have the means to do it.
In 1906, Britain upset the global balance of power when she launched the deadliest battleship yet conceived, HMS Dreadnought. This first all-big-gun battleship triggered an epidemic of dreadnought fever that soon spread to the great navies of the world. Britain was now caught in a new arms race of her own making. A dramatic game of one-upmanship that would help push the world towards a global catastrophe, and the largest naval confrontation in history. In the early years of the 20th century, Britain appeared relaxed and self-assured. The new monarch, King Edward, had inherited from his mother, Queen Victoria, an empire encompassing a quarter of the world. An empire that stood serene and unchallengeable, due largely to Britain's all-powerful fleet of battleships. The greatest threat to the British Empire came from the emerging industrial powerhouse of Germany, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II. In less than a decade, the Kaiser assembled the second-largest battle fleet in the world and prepared his nation to challenge Britain's long-held dominance of the seas.
And of course, in order to justify a powerful fleet in Germany, the supporters of the German fleet tend to sort of emphasize the possibility of conflict with Britain. And indeed, to justify naval expenditures in Britain, you get an emphasis on the possibility of conflict with Germany. And that's one of the great problems with naval races, is that they create perceptions of hostility.
In late 1906, the cream of British society flocked to the naval dockyards at Portsmouth. They came to see for themselves their nation's revolutionary answer to the German naval challenge.
Quite suddenly, in 1906, the British complete a new battleship called HMS Dreadnought. And this ship is completely different from everything else. She has a new kind of engine, steam turbines, which up to then has been in a few liners and mostly in small naval vessels. Her armament is a single type of gun. There are 10 of them, 10 12-inch guns. She has the firepower of 2.5 battleships. So she can probably destroy any other battleship in the world. So it's as though the barometer, if you like, of naval power has been completely reset.
With the world's first all-big-gun battleship, Britain hoped to put an end to its naval arms race with Germany. But it was an extraordinary gamble. In this one remarkable ship, Britain had rendered all battleships outmoded and inferior, including its own.
By rendering their older fleets not obsolete, but certainly less efficient, they gave other countries the opportunity, the temptation to catch up. And of course, in the very difficult international tension of that time, that is exactly what happened.
Kaiser Wilhelm's response to Dreadnought was indignation.
Well, the building of the Dreadnought really stunned the Germans, because this was the first ship which was built very, very secretly. The Germans knew that they either had to follow or that they had lost the race before it had really begun.
The political head of the Kaiser's navy, Admiral Tirpitz, saw Dreadnought not so much as a threat, but a development that could be to Germany's advantage. Tirpitz convinced the Kaiser and the German parliament that the battleship race could begin again, on almost equal terms. And besides political will, there was no reason for Germany not to overtake Britain in the contest. The Kaiser took up the challenge and began rebuilding his fleet with all big gun dreadnoughts.
There were great launching ceremonies taking place every year when a new battleship with a famous name was launched. Generally, the emperor came and gave a great speech, often to Tirpitz's disfavor, because Tirpitz thought that it would be much better to keep one's mouth shut and not to tell the British what the Germans were going to do.
In early 1908, British Admiralty received disturbing intelligence concerning Germany's shipbuilding program. Its largest industrial company, Krupp, had recently built a new plant to make battleship armaments. Now it was secretly buying large quantities of nickel, a metal essential for hardening steel and integral to the manufacture of guns and armor. Indeed, Krupp was building massive gun barrels for Germany's dreadnoughts, well in advance of government orders and in enormous numbers. Britain's First Sea Lord, Admiral Jackie Fisher, warned his government Germany might be building more dreadnoughts than the Kaiser admitted to. But the Liberal government was hostile to Fisher's demand for increased funding to meet the challenge. Prime Minister Asquith had come to power promising to cut the naval budget in favour of social welfare. But Fisher's position strengthened when Germany's closest allies, Austria and Italy, joined the dreadnought race. Out of mistrust for each other, Italy and Austria announced they were each building 4 floating fortresses of their own. With every dreadnought launched, Britain's naval superiority came under greater threat, and Europe edged closer and closer to war. By 1909, the mood in Britain verged on panic.
The rivalry with Germany created a situation where it was quite easy for politicians and publicists who wanted to sell newspapers to become paranoid.
Public pressure ultimately forced the Asquith government to bow to Fisher's demands for an all-out assault on the German challenge.
Fisher's objective is to break the back of the German challenge with an overwhelming response. Having raised the stakes with Dreadnought, his next objective was to break their challenge by going further. Not so much in quality this time as in quantity. And he persuaded the government through fair means and foul, mostly foul, to build 8 battleships in 1 year, something the Germans simply could not think about.
By doubling its annual shipbuilding program, The Royal Navy demonstrated to the world its resolve to outbuild any rival, whatever the cost. But ultimately, the British government felt it had been deceived. Germany was not secretly building more battleships than it publicly declared. Critics of Admiral Fisher claimed he had orchestrated the naval scare for his own ends and won the Royal Navy a shallow, conceited victory.
In fact, Fisher, in his secret writings, makes it clear he was quite confident that Britain had enough superiority. But in order to maintain the shipbuilding industry, in order to provide enough orders to keep this basic foundation of Britain's naval strength healthy, he connived at these rather unnecessary scares.
By 1911, the naval scare had evaporated. At the unveiling of a memorial for Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany walked together with the new British King, George V. Both were Victoria's grandsons, and the event marked a thawing in the relationship between the rival empires. Months later, a young, dynamic politician, Winston Churchill, became Britain's first Lord of the Admiralty. In controversial style, he quickly placed his stamp on Britain's most important bulwark, the battleship. Churchill's most significant achievement was to encourage the design and building of the Queen Elizabeth class of super dreadnoughts, the most powerful battleships the world had seen. Their 8 15-inch guns would be the dominant naval weapons of the era, capable of firing 2,000-pound shells more than 13 miles. Churchill gambled heavily with the Queen Elizabeth class vessels. They were the world's first oil-powered battleships. Britain had no oil of her own, so she bought a major shareholding in the Shah of Persia's oil fields to guarantee supplies in the event of war. The days of the coal-fired battleship were numbered. Coal was dirty and time-consuming to take aboard. It also forewarned an enemy with a telltale smoke cloud that could be seen beyond the horizon. But by 1914, little could conceal the potential for war in Europe. The German military machine, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, now seemed ready to carry its nation to war. As early as 1907, the Kaiser revealed his anticipation for war when he ordered the widening of the Kiel Canal to accommodate Germany's new fleet of dreadnoughts.
The decision to widen the canal to carry dreadnoughts was critical to the ability of the Germans to function as a first-class navy. If they were going to fight the British and they found half their fleet was stuck in the Baltic and would have to come around the north of Denmark, they would be engaged as they came round the north of Denmark by the Royal Navy and destroyed. It was critical to their strategic position to widen that canal so that she could use the full range of her facilities for a modern dreadnought fleet. So it was in that sense a hostile act.
The canal reopened in June 1914. It was a festive occasion. For the celebrations, the German High Seas Fleet welcomed a courtesy squadron of 4 British dreadnoughts and 3 cruisers. In mid-afternoon on Sunday the 28th of June, an urgent telegram reached the Kaiser's ship Hohenzollern. It was chilling news. The Kaiser's close friend Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria had been assassinated, along with his wife, in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. The festivities at Kiel ended abruptly. The ships of the Royal Navy sailed from German waters to take up their stations in the event of war.
There was no hate against Germany, and within the German Naval Officer Corps there was no hate against the British. And when the British ships left the harbor of Kiel, they made the single, friends today, friends in future, friends forever.
A single gunshot in the Balkans had sparked the First World War. And when German boots trampled neutral Belgium, British troops were mobilized in pursuit. But if the land was to be where the dying took place, both Britain and Germany knew it was the sea where the war could be won or lost, in a single decisive battle. On the eve of hostilities, British Admiralty made a far-sighted decision to move its main naval base to Scapa Flow, off the northern coast of Scotland. In this isolated, windswept harbour, the Royal Navy assembled the most powerful battle fleet in history. 33 Dreadnought battleships would spearhead its imposingly named Grand Fleet. 4 fast battle cruisers would act as scouts in advance of the battle fleet. This new class of capital ship was identical to battleships in firepower, but gained extra speed at the expense of armour protection. A design of vessel yet to be tested in war at sea. Scores of support vessels, submarines, torpedo craft, destroyers and cruisers would scout for and attack enemy ships, as well as screen their own capital ships in battle. With 177 large warships on call, Britain possessed a formidable superiority over Germany of 2 to 1.
When war starts in 1914, no one really knows what a big naval battle will be like. No one has ever concentrated the number of modern battleships the British have in one place. No one knows how well they can be controlled. No one knows how well they can hit at the ranges that they claim to fight at. So every naval officer in the world is waiting to see what a big battle will be like.
Winston Churchill's ultimate aim was to bring the German high seas fleet to battle and destroy it with his massive fleet of battleships and battlecruisers. But instead of enticing his enemy to sea with a close blockade of their coast, Churchill confounded Germany by ordering a distant blockade.
The British immediately do what Tirpitz does not expect. He expects them to follow Royal Naval tradition and try some sort of Copenhagening maneuver, which means they will immediately move on German naval bases, confront the German fleet, and try to destroy it prematurely before it can get itself prepared. They don't adopt that at all, right? They pull away from the coast and set up a standoff blockade. Which means the next move is the German move. The Germans don't know what to do.
Alfred Tirpitz argued for an all-out sea battle with Britain, even though the Kaiser had brought on the war too early and his fleet was far from optimum strength.
He was not at all prepared for war, and he knew it. This is no illusion as far as he was concerned. Would he share that with the Reichstag? Certainly not. Would he share that with many of his lesser commanders? Certainly not.
Germany's first blooding in the war at sea was to have an enormous impact on the Kaiser. As thousands of British troops set out across the English Channel to France, British Admiralty ordered a daring diversionary mission to ensure their safe passage. British light naval forces were dispatched to intercept enemy patrols near the German coast at Heligoland Bight. With their battleships still at anchor, a flotilla of German cruisers and destroyers fell unsupported into the British trap. Despite dreadful odds, their crews took the fight to the enemy. After 4 hours of chaotic action, a backup squadron of Britain's powerful battle cruisers moved in. Three German light cruisers and a destroyer, along with 1,000 men, were lost in the encounter. For Germany, the effect on morale far outweighed the losses in ships and men. The Kaiser issued orders limiting the power of his commanders and demanding the High Seas Fleet not to leave port again without his approval.
From a naval point of view, this was disastrous because the Navy had been built to fight Britain and to beat Britain. This was against their code of honor. And as well, it also helped to destroy the confidence of the people in the Navy.
With the Kaiser as its supreme commander, the German High Seas Fleet appeared in serious trouble from the start. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, entered the war with confidence in its leadership. Commander of the High Seas Fleet, Sir John Jellicoe, was arguably Britain's most respected sea admiral. The commander of the battle cruiser squadron, the flamboyant Vice Admiral David Beatty, immediately became a national hero for his victory at Heligoland Bight. To Winston Churchill, Britain's magnificent dreadnoughts and their crews were the culminating manifestation of naval force in the history of the world. But Germany had a wild card that no British admiral had ever had to contend with: the U-boat. In the first months of the war, U-boats sank 5 British cruisers and 1 pre-dreadnought battleship. The early successes of the undersea raider sent a clear message to Britain. The combination of the U-boat and the torpedo could wreak havoc on her battle fleet. In a letter to Churchill, Jellicoe argued for extreme caution. It would be suicide for Britain, he said, to lose her advantage over Germany in dreadnought numbers. Instead of the early sea battle everyone expected, the world's 2 most powerful battle fleets glared at each other across the brooding waters of the North Sea and wondered if their Trafalgar would ever come. With his battleships grounded at Wilhelmshaven, the commander of the German fleet, Admiral von Ingenohl, devised a strategy to revive the morale of his crews and, more importantly, seriously dent Britain's naval superiority.
The German problem was that their fleet was just not strong enough to take on the British Grand Fleet and its battlecruiser supporting fleet with any chance of success. Therefore, it had to come up with rather unsatisfactory alternatives. And the least unsatisfactory alternative was to try to draw out a portion of that Grand Fleet, probably the battlecruiser fleet, which was operating increasingly autonomously out of its base in Rosyth, into a situation where it could trap the battlecruiser fleet and with its full strength sink it. This would be quite a shock for the British in morale terms, and it would also, particularly if it could be repeated, if the exercise could be repeated again, perhaps grind the British battle fleet down to a point where a full-scale battle was on the cards. And so the Germans begin their policy of sort of tweaking the lion's tail.
With the Kaiser's approval, Admiral von Ingenohl laid a trap for Beatty's battle cruiser squadron. The bait, the towns and people of the Yorkshire coast. Audacious lightning strikes by Germany's battle cruisers brought the war to British soil for the first time. The British press condemned the targeting of innocent civilians. It was the first indication that the fledgling German Navy had little regard for tradition and moral conduct in war. On their first two sorties, the coastal raiders achieved little, slipping away before the British warships arrived at the scene. But on January the 23rd, 1915, Admiral Hipper's battlecruiser squadron set out on another raid. Their target, Britain's East Coast fishing fleet, which Germany believed was laying mines and gathering information for the Admiralty. But the Royal Navy had no need for fishing trawlers for their intelligence. Unknown to Germany, Britain had in its possession a captured codebook and a network of radio direction-finding posts along the coast.
What they don't know is the British have broken their codes, so instead of the raids being real surprises that may attract sudden reactions by some small number of British ships, the British know when the fleet comes out.
Vice Admiral Beatty's battle cruisers were ordered to sea to intercept the German raiders and bring them to battle. But what British intelligence failed to pick up was that Hipper would be supported by the entire German high seas fleet. The following day, Beatty intercepted Hipper's squadron at Dogger Bank. The Royal Navy had fallen into a German trap and faced certain defeat. Destroyers on both sides exchanged live fire. But rather than join in the battle, the German commander, Ingenohl, panicked. He ordered the high seas fleet to sail at full speed for home. The British battlecruisers gave chase. Accurate German counterfire forced Beatty's flagship Lion to retire. But in retreat, the Germans lost the fast armoured cruiser Blücher, along with more than 900 men. The Kaiser was furious over the debacle at Dogger Bank. He stood down his high seas commander for not engaging the British. Ironically, Admiral Ingenohl was merely following the Kaiser's order not to risk his beloved dreadnoughts. Until further notice, the high seas fleet would remain at anchor, imprisoned yet again by the Kaiser's paranoia. Over the coming months, Churchill grew increasingly frustrated by the failure to bring the German fleet to heel. In February 1915, he presented a dramatic plan to the War Council, one that could benefit from an offensive naval action. Weeks earlier, Turkey had strengthened Germany's cause by declaring war on the Allies as retribution for a century of bullying by Britain and Russia. Under the German Kaiser's guidance, Turkey prepared to attack its neighbor, Russia, in the Caucasus. The Kaiser predicted Russia would be unable to spare troops from the Eastern Front to repel the Turks. He was correct. Tsar Nicholas appealed to Britain for a diversion to be made against Turkey to relieve the threat of invasion. Churchill argued against a land campaign. Instead, he convinced the War Council that battleships could break through the Dardanelles Straits to the Turkish capital of Constantinople and put Turkey out of the war. The War Council immediately ordered the dreadnought Queen Elizabeth to sail directly to the Dardanelles. One of the most powerful battleships on Earth would spearhead a squadron of 8 British capital ships. If all went to plan, the naval operation would change the course of the war. But if the Queen Elizabeth came to grief, it would be a massive propaganda coup for Germany and her allies. Four French battleships steamed out of Algiers to join the contingent. For the first time since Trafalgar, the warships of France and Britain rendezvoused for battle. But on this occasion, they were allies. The heavy guns opened up on the forts of the Dardanelles and Gallipoli Peninsula in an all-out effort to force the passage. But after pounding the Turkish fortifications for a month, the campaign proved a failure. Finally, it was abandoned after more than a third of the Allied ships were sunk or damaged by mines and Turkish counterfire. 4 weeks later, the squadron was back at action stations, paving the way for the fateful land offensive at Gallipoli. In one of the most controversial campaigns of the war, 300,000 Allied troops perished. Defeat in both campaigns was a major setback for Britain and resulted in Churchill's removal from the Admiralty. The appearance of long-range German U-boats in the Mediterranean brought new perils for Britain. After 2 warships were sunk, the Queen Elizabeth was recalled to home base. Still hoping for an all-out battle with Germany, Britain could not afford to sacrifice a single dreadnought to the marauding undersea raiders. Meanwhile, Germany's U-boat campaign had entered a new, more deadly phase. In retaliation for the British blockade of his country, Admiral Tirpitz convinced the Kaiser to declare the waters around the British Isles a war zone. Any ships met in this zone would be sunk without warning. But the sinking of the giant ocean liner Lusitania, with the loss of 1,200 innocent passengers, including 120 Americans, was a serious miscalculation. US President Woodrow Wilson pressured the Kaiser to cancel the U-boat campaign, with the threat that neutral America would enter the war against Germany. In frustration at the Kaiser's backdown, Admiral Tirpitz resigned. The architect of the German Navy had had enough.
After the sinking of the Lusitania, the Germans more or less had to give up the campaign. they had started in February 1915. For the Navy, this was a great disappointment because it had nothing to do. It lay in the harbors of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel and began rusting. Everybody began losing confidence in the Navy. So when Admiral Scheer finally became Commander-in-Chief of the High Seas Fleet, he thought that it would be necessary to be more offensive in order to challenge at least part of the Grand Fleet and sink them and to show the flag in the North Sea.
On May the 31st, 1916, the German High Seas Fleet, commanded by Admiral Scheer, put to sea. "22 battleships, 5 battle cruisers, 11 cruisers, and 61 torpedo boats sailed into the North Sea, hoping to intercept a British squadron. For 2 days, the fleet scoured the area, gathering intelligence.
Scheer used both airships and U-boats, in effect to try to sweep the area before him in the North Sea to find out what was out there, to see if he could effectively sortie, have his presence reported, draw the Royal Navy out in a component, engage and retreat.
He was not trying to take on the British fleet in its full strength. All he was trying to do was to draw a portion of it into a situation where he could inflict disproportionate attrition upon it.
In the waters beyond Scapa Flow and Rosyth, German U-boats lay in ambush. If some of the British Grand Fleet could be enticed into the North Sea, the undersea raiders were ordered to sink as many dreadnoughts as possible. Unknown to Scheer, British Admiralty knew of the plan 2 weeks earlier. With the aid of the captured codebook, the Royal Navy had deciphered radio messages when the U-boats left for the patrol lines. On May 30th, another decoded message confirmed Scheer's plan to set sail the next morning. It was the moment Britain had been waiting for almost 2 years. Prepared for action, Jellicoe's battleship sailed from Scapa Flow 2 hours before Scheer's fleet had even left port. At the same time, the British battlecruiser fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral David Beatty, left the Firth of Forth. The British ships slipped past the German U-boats without incident. They hoped to intercept the German High Seas Fleet off the west coast of Danish Jutland, a name soon to become etched in naval history. At 1447, Beatty ordered HMS Engadine to send up one of her seaplanes to reconnoitre. Half an hour later, the German fleet was sighted. It was the first time aircraft had ever been used in a fleet action. But its efforts were in vain. A radio message confirming the sighting never reached Beatty's flagship. The German battle fleet now knew the Royal Navy was in the vicinity. But was it a squadron or the entire British Grand Fleet? The commander of the German battlecruisers, Rear Admiral Franz Hipper, sighted Beatty's battlecruisers on the horizon at 15:20. 28 minutes later, almost immediately, German gunnery proved devastatingly accurate against the British support craft. Then, in the space of half an hour, Beatty lost 2 of his 6 battlecruisers, Indefatigable and Queen Mary. with virtually all hands.
Causing Admiral Beatty to make his famous comment, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." There was. It wasn't so much the ships themselves, it was the way they're handling their ammunition. Ammunition doors are kept open, charges are taken out of their fireproof cases, piled up. These are charges that have at each end an igniter, which means that the whole thing is a disaster waiting to happen.
Despite his losses, Beatty was able to outwit his opponents, forcing the German fleet to pursue him, luring them into the clutches of Jellicoe's massive Grand Fleet.
So he's come up against every German admiral's worst nightmare, a one-on-one with the Grand Fleet.
At around 1800, 44 of the world's most powerful battleships went into action against each other. Countless support craft on both sides, cruisers, torpedo boats and destroyers, joined in the melee. Facing far superior numbers and outranged by British guns, the German fleet was struggling for its very existence. The British fleet, however, was dogged by poor communications and inaccurate intelligence. Finally, a brilliant turnaround maneuver by Scheer enabled his fleet to escape. Fearing mines and submarines, Jellicoe did not attempt pursuit. The battle seemed over. But half an hour later, Scheer made an extraordinary move.
He puts up another hoist, and they do a battle turn around again, directly back at the Grand Fleet, which a lot of historians have called the suicide route. And his ships open up with everything they've got. Of course, Jellicoe's immediate reaction is textbook. He turns 2 points away from the onslaught. And all of his ships simultaneously open up. And there's this amazing barrage of firepower. But also the Germans get quite a few shells in and do an amazing amount of damage. And then Scheer says, look, you know, there are limits to even this. He orders his torpedo boats in close in. They laid down a spread of torpedoes. The last of the boats putting down a smoke screen. Scheer does another hoist for a 180-degree about turn. They go back about again, and they steam away from the Grand Fleet into the cordite smoke and under the cover of smoke and torpedoes. His ability to exert command and control on site, and his desire to keep Jellicoe off balance, and to keep Jellicoe reacting to him, may very well, in my estimation, have been the only thing that saved him.
Rather than pursue the German fleet through oncoming torpedoes, Jellicoe made the most controversial decision of his career. He turned away, allowing their escape.
What did actually happen was, of course, that Jellicoe obeyed his own orders. Jellicoe had written Grand Fleet battle orders and said, in the face of a torpedo attack by enemy destroyers, the fleet will turn away. knowing that that was the prudent thing to do. That was the order you wrote if you were the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon.
The German ships limped back into port, testifying to the ferocity of the battle. Germany had lost only 2 capital ships, compared to Britain's 3, and was hailed as evidence of the superiority of German engineering and gunnery. Moreover, Berlin newspapers praised German efficiency, determination and heroism in battle, which had finally brought to an end the myth of Trafalgar.
From the Germans' point of view, it was an unimaginable victory. The Kaiser was overjoyed. Of course, Scheer immediately gets the Blue Max, the Polymerit, which is the highest military award that the German Empire can give. Only the most optimistic of them can possibly imagine, and Scheer does not, that this is a strategic victory. He's won tactically, but he knows he hasn't won strategically.
In the first instance, the German communique on the battle was wholly dishonest. They managed to forget the largest of their own casualties, exaggerated the British casualties and claimed they'd won. But war and battle is not about casualties, it's about winning the battle and commanding the ground at the end. The Germans lost the battle. They lost the battle as soon as they realized they'd met the entire Grand Fleet. They ran away.
After Jutland, the victors, King George visits the fleet to honor England's heroes.
Overall, the British confirmed their superiority. Rather like Trafalgar, Jutland confirmed that the British ruled the seas, and the Germans only came out at sufferance and had to go home as soon as possible.
And Britannia rules the waves.
Of the 8,500 men who perished in the Battle of Jutland, more than 6,000 were British sailors. 2,000 alone went down with the 3rd battlecruiser lost, HMS Invincible. Strategic victory or not, it was a serious blow to a people who attached such importance to their navy.
Jutland was a terrible disappointment. The public were bitterly disappointed, and the Navy had to defend its position. And there are lots and lots of letters from naval officers saying, come on. You know, the first ones say, we gave them a right tousing. And then when they realized what had happened, and the public realized what had happened, they were thrown back on the defensive and began writing letters saying, come on, it wasn't as bad as all that.
The government and the press immediately began searching for scapegoats. While Beatty and his battlecruisers had taken the brunt of the punishment, Jellicoe's battleships had returned to port without loss. Within the year, Beatty would replace Jellicoe as commander of the High Seas Fleet. Even King George V expressed dismay at Jellicoe's poor control of the fleet and timidity in battle.
Of course, Jellicoe takes an incredible barrage of abuse from his own people for not finishing Scheer when he had him, which I think is a vast underestimation of the German High Seas Fleet, of Reinhard Scheer, and also of the circumstances of the time. Jellicoe was a fine commander and a very, very able person. And to refight the battle on Monday morning, so to speak, is something that one should not do.
Apart from the strategic consequences of the Battle of Jutland, it really represented the flower of British and German industrial output. The battleships spoke much of what these countries were capable of producing, and they were manned, of course, by the cream of British and German manhood. So to that extent, it was a clash long anticipated, but one which was destined to end very badly for a large number of people.
Following the Battle of Jutland, Britain remained in control of the seas. But the clash of the great dreadnoughts had failed to bring a promised end to the conflict. Over the coming months, as the Great War engulfed the globe, naval strategists on both sides would dream of another encounter between their massive fleets. But for the thousands of young sailors who had already perished, without hope of rescue or understanding of the issues, both glory and defeat lay in a cold, anonymous grave.